Celeste. I'm going to be the moderator of this event, obviously. I'll introduce the speakers as they come up, but first up, the speaker in favour of capitalism will be Matthew Lesh, a research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. The speakers will get 8 minutes each, and then when they're at 7 minutes, I'll give them a knock, and when they hit 8 minutes, I will tell them more increasingly aggressively to wind up, and I'm not afraid to pull the microphone in if I have to. So please make welcome Matthew Lesh.
Let's start today with 3 facts. 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 30 years. Global life expectancy has doubled from 30 to 60 just in the last century, and global inequality has decreased for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, thanks to the rise of the developing world. The essential point that John and I will be making today is that capitalism is essential for human flourishing and establishing a moral, equitable, and tolerant society. But first, I'm going to do a little bit of debating 101 as a first affirmative and really deal with what the terms we're talking about here today. In sum, capitalism is a system of private ownership of property, the means of production and exchange. With that often comes low taxation and minimal regulation. Sorry to my good friend at the back, but capitalism is not Donald Trump, bank bailouts, or the Iraq War. Capitalism is about the way we structure our economy, while socialism is the opposite of capitalism in the sense that it is a system of the means of production, distribution, and exchange centrally controlled by the government. The comparative topic means that not only do we have to prove that capitalism is better than socialism, and not just say what the problems of socialism are, those on the opposite side, their burden is to explain how socialism this time will be different to the times socialism has been tried and led to starvation, gulags, and tyranny. I'm going to be looking at why capitalism works and why it's moral, while my second speaker, John, will be discussing how it creates a more equal society, is better for the environment, and more tolerant of minorities and women. Thanks to the capitalist system, we live in more peaceful, prosperous, and longer lives than ever before. Capitalism is a poverty-fighting machine. It is thanks to capitalism that global poverty has halved in the last 30 years. There is so much prosperity that for the first time in human history, there is more concern, there are more people who are obese than us, morbidly obese than are starving. That is just how successful it has been. It has not always been like this, of course. For most of human history, life was, as Hobbes said, short, nasty, and brutish. But today, capitalism has unleashed human flourishing. As Steven Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now, chronicles, things have improved extensively since the Industrial Revolution. We have seen a reduction in war, violence and homicides, child mortality, labour and deforestation. Meanwhile, there's been an increase in education, leisure time, travel, tourism, human rights, and much, much more. There's dozens of metrics that Pinker goes through. Yes, the rich have gotten better off, but so have the poor. Today's poor have more to eat and access to better technologies like planes, phones and cars that were unimaginable even to someone who was rich 50 years ago. So why does this work? Why does capitalism work? That's essential to understand. For most of human history, it was thought that there was a limited wealth available. There was a small pie which had to be separated. One king could only get rich by stealing from another king. Therefore, being rich is immoral, since you've taken from others. This is the fatal mistake usually made by socialists. What the capitalist system has done is given us technological and scientific advancement, which has expanded the pie and meant that we're all much more prosperous. The free market has given us pesticides to grow more food, it's given us machines to produce more products, and it's given us phones and computers to learn more and communicate. In capitalism, you succeed not by stealing from others, but by doing good for others, by doing better, by innovating. It is the baker who gets successful by baking the best bread. It is Steve Jobs who gets rich by making Macs and iPhones. The essential mechanism of capitalism is, of course, the market. In the marketplace, and this is a bit boring and complex, but it's extremely important. In the marketplace, you purchase products that fulfill your desires. Producers respond to our purchases by allocating their time and effort to what we want and using society's resources for what we demand. Now, prices then reflect what the relative value is of goods and services to everything else. The market system isn't this way, it's highly democratic. It is you choosing what you buy. It is each individual sending signals throughout the system. As Hajek explained, a central planner in a socialist system fails because they lack the essential knowledge that is within all of us about what we need and what we want. It means that a central planner can never have the knowledge to allocate resources like we can through the decisions that we make. Capitalism treats humans as they are. It channels perhaps the worst of human instincts, which is our instinct to want to do better, into helping others and positive outcomes through profit-seeking pursuits. Socialism, in contrast, is a utopia that cannot and does not exist. Socialism requires people to work for others with no immediate benefit. This may work in a close-knit family, but it cannot organise for millions. What begins with appeals to people power and ends with hospitals without medicine, supermarkets without food, and violent suppression of dissent. In fact, the Black Book of Communism calculated there has been 100 million people died under socialist oppression in the 20th century. Today, Venezuela is a later socialist catastrophe. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1989, he promised Socialism 101. He nationalised industry throughout businessmen, and the government set prices. This central planning failed epically. What we've seen in socialism today is the country with the world's largest non-oil reserves in absolute poverty. Supermarkets are empty, 9 in 10 Venezuelans go hungry, prison inmates are foraging for rats. The average Venezuelan has lost 8.5 kilos. They call this, after the latest president's name, the Maduro diet. Now, Maduro is even, it's reported today, sending people packages in order to convince of food to starving people in order to convince them to vote for him. Meanwhile, the healthcare system has collapsed and crime and murder is spiking. People flee socialism, not capitalism. Socialist East Germany did not build the Berlin Wall to keep people from leaving East Germany. They built it to keep people in. They built it so that citizens could not escape. Today, 10% of Venezuelans have left the country altogether to escape socialism. But even if everything I just said was wrong, even if for some miraculous reason socialism could work, it is still not the morally righteous system. In capitalism, you pursue your own desires, live as you choose, and earn money as you please, and spend it on the things that you want to spend it on. When you essentially direct the economy, you are telling people how to live their lives. You are telling them what they can and cannot do, in a system premised on force, not freedom. In order to sustain a social system to stop people from private economic activity, social and political activity has to be oppressed. In socialist countries, that's why you see political parties banned, opposition candidates jailed, and speech curtailed. In capitalist countries, you are welcome to set up a commune and live collectively, like a kibbutz in Israel. Now, I have a question for those opposite I want them to answer. If in your socialist system, if I set up a commune, so if I set up a business, would I be welcome to do so? In a capitalist system, you're free to go forth and profilate for socialism, as we're seeing those opposite are going to be doing today. I have a question for those opposite. If I advocate for socialism, if I advocate for capitalism in their socialist system, will I be able to do that? Yes. If history is the guide for anything ahead of us, it is the fact that as a glasses-wearing bourgeoisie, I can expect to be in the gulag at best. In sum, it is intrinsically interlinked capitalism is intrinsically interlinked to human freedom. It is a moral system that promotes human flourishing. Thank you very much.
Our first speaker in opposition will be Elliot Downs. Elliot's a history student here at Latrobe and the president of the Socialist Alternative Club. Please make them welcome.
All right, well, that was a lovely story, but unfortunately none of that was true. So I'm going to start with the reality of what capitalism actually means. According to the latest Oxfam Inequality Report, 42 people now own as much wealth as the bottom 3.7 billion. And in Australia, the supposed lucky country, the richest 1% own more wealth than the bottom 70% combined. So the reality is we live in a society in vast abundance, but the vast majority of us are denied and excluded from that wealth. Currently, all of the productive resources of society are controlled by a tiny minority of people, capitalists, who use that control over the economy to maximise their profits relative to their competitors. This inequality is really tied to the fact that capitalism is a fundamentally class-divided system. And so for the vast majority of us, unless we're wealthy enough to opt out of the labour market, economic necessity compels us to work for a capitalist. So Jeff Bezos, for example, the CEO of Amazon, recently became the richest person in the world last year, worth just over $100 billion. Whereas Amazon workers, on the other hand, earn around $13 an hour, and 700,000 of them are so poor that they actually rely on food stamps from the US government. The US government subsidises these workers' wages, they're so poor. And under capitalism, it's not the case that we get to live our lives exactly as we wish. Actually, the reality is we are told how we can live our lives from the bosses. Bosses get to decide what time we get up in the morning, what we wear that day, when we're allowed to eat or go to the bathroom, what our facial expression has to be while we're at work, and whether at the end of the week we can afford to pay rent or buy food. So I think for the vast majority of us, it is simply not the case that under capitalism we can pursue our own desires. Bosses are also the ones who get to make the major decisions about society and how it's run. So, for example, whether investment is going to happen in, say, public housing or military funding, whether money is going to be spent on fossil fuels or on renewable energy. And this is not a democratic system at all. I also wanted to address the idea that people become capitalists by virtue of their intelligence or willingness to take risks or some kind of important work they do, because I think all of that is bullshit. The only role these people play in the productive process under capitalism is simply owning all of those resources. The reality is, actually, it's workers that produce everything of value in society, and our labour is the source of all profits earned by the capitalists. So just some facts for you guys. In 2016, the average hourly wage in the private sector in Australia was $34, but the average value of production per employee in the private sector was $61. So that means that every hour of every working day, the capitalists extract an average of $27 from each worker they employ. And the only capital bosses or CEOs ever risk is money that they've stolen from the working class. That's where all of their inheritance originally comes from. So I think we'll actually find that the definition of capitalism is a society that involves mass systemic theft from others. And you only have to look at what happens during strikes to see the truth in this. So when workers stop working, bosses go hysterical about how much money they're losing. Whereas if Gina Reinhardt took a holiday or just a really long sleep in one morning, iron ore would continue to be dug out of the ground and she would continue to earn $2 million every hour. So under capitalism, workers are free simply to choose which one of those capitalists will be the one to exploit us. So I think if the other side were actually standing for freedom, they would be for workers taking control of their workplaces, democratically, collectively running it themselves. Capitalism is a fundamentally unfree society. And that exploitation can only be maintained by extreme amounts of state force and coercion that's tied to that economic coercion. So I think we only have to look at what happens when workers do take effective strike action, when they withdraw their labour, to see the truth in this. The state declares that illegal. They say that workers are violating private property rights, and that if they don't go home, they'll send in the police to break that strike up. Or we can look at the barbarism that refugees around the world are subjected to. While commodities are able to cross borders with total ease, the people that make them, their bodies, their lives are heavily regulated and controlled. If they cross those arbitrary lines on a map without permission, they face barbed wire, bullets, and the prospect of being locked up in torture camps for the rest of their lives. And all of that massive state violence and force is an integral part of modern capitalism. So what's the alternative? Well, I think the starting point for socialists is that there is no need for society to be organised this way. It's not efficient, it's not rational, and it does not meet human need. Socialism is based on the belief that in a world of vast wealth, poverty, homelessness, starvation and oppression can and should be relegated to the past. By socialism, we mean a world in which the productive resources of society are controlled by the vast majority of us, rather than a parasitical minority at the top of society. We mean a society in which workers democratically and collectively run their workplaces and establish mechanisms for asserting their control over society more broadly. And the idea that we can't collectively decide how best to do that, especially in the age of modern technology, is quite frankly absurd. So no, based on this definition, the USSR is not socialist, East Germany is not socialist, and Venezuela today is not socialist. Government intervention into the market or some degree of state ownership of industry doesn't change the fact that these countries, I would agree, like Australia and like the US, are oppressive, class-divided societies in which the vast majority of the population are exploited by a minority in power. So good we've got that out of the way. Now on to some of the other lies or untruths that the opposing side said about capitalism. Firstly, capitalism does not promote human advancement or innovation. It holds it back exponentially. So yes, unlike previous societies, say feudalism or societies based on slavery, for the first time in human history, we have a great abundance, and this is quite obvious if we look around the world today. But if your starting point for an economic and political system is how best to meet human need, then capitalism fails at every point. And that's not because resources are scarce, like in previous societies anymore. No, it's because the allocation of those resources are subordinated to the need of those capitalists to make profit. So globally, we produce 1.5 the amount of food required to feed everyone on the planet, yet approximately 9 million people die of hunger every year. Hundreds of millions more go hungry because they can't afford to buy it. There are over 1 million empty properties in this country alone, a figure that is only increasing, yet there are around 100,000 homeless people. And that's because under capitalism, food is not made to be eaten, houses aren't made to be lived in, they're made to be sold on the market, and they're only supplied insofar as people can afford to pay for them. So that's your wonderful price mechanism in action. That's your wonderful human flourishing. So, on to the development of technology. Well, I think it's just ridiculous that any kind of economic system produces technology. Actually, what makes everything is workers. So even under capitalism, everything is the product of collective human labour. Without billions of workers around the world assembling our technology, mining raw materials, transporting them across borders, nothing would be produced at all. Steve Jobs has never made an iPhone in his life. He relies on hyper-exploited workers in China. And so I think a genuinely socialist society could solve all of these horrors overnight. Starving people, for example, could easily be fed by using the world's vast transportation networks to get the 1.3 tonnes of food produced every year to those who need it. And there's no technological or logistical barrier to this. It's simply the way capitalism is run, only in the interest of profit. By dismantling the power of the capitalist class and removing that need, we wouldn't need to work so many hours. We could actually, develop as human beings in ways that are currently stifled by capitalism. For example, the 4 richest people in the world could guarantee that healthcare, clean water, and basic education to literally every human being on this planet. And so I think that kind of world is not only theoretically nicer, but actually possible. The fact that we do all of that work creates the basis to reorganise production to meet human lives and happiness. And with millions of people around the world increasingly seeing socialism as the answer to this vast inequality, I think the solution should be obvious.
Okay, so our third speaker is the campus coordinator of the Institute of Public Affairs, John Hajek.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry to say, but the Socialist Alternatives case so far wouldn't cut the mustard at a grade 4 debating workshop. We had no comparison that the motion demands, I know it was a sick burn, wasn't it, guys, between the two systems. They assumed as a premise exactly what they had to prove by saying capitalism is by definition a system of exploitation, instead of proving that that's what results from a system of private ownership of the means of production. And they gave no reasons as to why there is a direct link between, for example, capitalism and keeping out immigrants or refugees. There is no relation at all between those two things. You can easily be a capitalist and support the private ownership of the means of production and support letting refugees or immigrants into your countries. Moreover, we had no response to the poverty and global equality that Matthew talked about, which presents a bit of a problem for you guys. Because according to you, we have a world that is neoliberal and becoming more neoliberal by the minute. Meanwhile, 1.5 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. That seems pretty much incongruent with the doctrine that socialism always causes more, capitalism always causes more and more poverty. Moreover, and fatally for their case, they gave no alternative explanation as to how, in the absence of the price mechanism and the profit motive, which are key to being able to allocate resources and to know that you're actually producing something that's worth more than the sum of its parts, could be replaced under a socialist system. When the rubber hits the road after you've massacred the bourgeoisie, how do you decide how much rubber to use for car tyres or pencil erasers or whatever without the price mechanism that does that effortlessly and automatically under the status quo? Always it ends up in you running out of toilet paper, without exception. So, I want to talk firstly about profit. And I have a question. If corporate profits come from exploiting workers, then where do corporate losses come from? And I'd like an answer from the socialist alternative, because it seems to logically mean that those are cases of workers exploiting corporations. If you took 20 minutes out of your life to actually research this, you'd know that profits are not, in a free market, in the absence of government intervention, corporations exploiting workers. What they are the premium that a capitalist or a business owner gets from forwarding a worker the end product of his labour, so that he doesn't have to go through the lengthy and possibly dangerous and risky process of accumulating capital by himself. It is true, as he said, to some people they have no choice but to work for a capitalist. We say if that's the case, then don't leave them without a capitalist to provide them the only means of living that they have. If you don't have the means to start your own bakery, it's lucky that there are other people who own bakeries that you can work for right now. They tell us we live at the pleasure of bosses. They even tell us that it's because of these bosses tell us what time to get up in the morning. This is actually an important concession, and I actually kind of agree with you, because I agreed that under capitalism, under socialism, no one would ever show up for work on time. But if it's such a big deal, and if you think people are so desperate to get up at, 10:30 a.m., I've got a brilliant idea for you guys. Start your own business. Run from 10:30 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. and because that's so much more popular, you'll be flooded with workers who you can pay less than everyone else, and you'll make a killing. You should be really thankful for that helpful advice from me. So, immigrants and refugees. Again, it's very true that immigrants and refugees are much less of a problem for social societies, precisely because no one wants to immigrate to them and no refugee ever tries to get into them. It's true that East Germany didn't have to worry very hard about all the people trying to cross borders into East Germany, whether to process them onshore or offshore. What they did have to worry about was building a wall and shooting people in the back when they tried to flee the socialist utopia that they'd set up in East Germany. As I said in my introduction, there is nothing about supporting capitalism or supporting the private ownership and the means of production that means you also have to support keeping refugees or immigrants out of your countries. In fact, it makes it easier to absorb them, because under capitalism, they are more likely to become productive members of society who don't threaten to take from the people who already live in that society. Instead of under socialism, when they'd be guaranteed, generous welfare benefits and lots of benefits from womb to tomb, those people are perceived as much more of a burden on that society, and people are likely to be far less welcoming to those people. Next we hear all these people are starving and yet we produce so much food, 50% more than we actually need. I'd say it's a bit rich to talk about starvation coming from a socialist, but if so, by their own analysis, apparently capitalists are so rapacious and will do anything to make a quick buck, yet at the same time they're willing to let millions of piles of oranges and apples just sit in piles and rot. That is totally incongruous, and you've got to ask yourself why it is that we grow surplus food and then let it rot. Maybe it's because of things like government price floors or government subsidies, which encourage the artificial growing of too much food that we don't need. That's something to think about. I want to talk firstly in my sort of substantive material about inequality, and I want to address one big canard first. We heard from the first speaker that the top 42 people in the world, the richest, have more than the bottom 50%, whatever it is. I've done this debate about 4 times and had to correct the socialist alternative every time here. That measure is meaningless because it measures net worth. And if you have debt, even if you're quite affluent like I am, for example, being a middle-class member of a capitalist society like Australia, you are still poorer than a rural Chinese farmer who owns nothing but a few tools but has no debt. And so the poorest 30% of the world are actually affluent people in Western societies who have more debt who have a negative net worth because they have a lot of debt, like the Clintons when they left the White House, or Donald Trump at various points in his career. So you heard it here first. The socialist alternative supports taxing working people in order to give handouts to Donald Trump. We'd say, though, more importantly, real inequality has decreased because of capitalism. The average American today is richer than John D. Rockefeller was 100 years ago. They have technology that John D. Rockefeller couldn't have dreamed of. TVs, air conditioning, whatever, all because of capitalist progress. And the trajectory of capitalist progress is that what rich people have in their houses one generation, poor people can have in their cars the next generation, whether it be televisions, air conditioning, Wi-Fi, or whatever. Meanwhile, all socialists do is complain that capitalism can't provide in equal measure what socialism can provide to nobody. Moreover, we told you we're not fascinated particularly by Western societies. We told you global inequality has actually decreased because massive countries like China and India embraced market reforms in the 70s and 90s respectively, and since then hundreds of millions of people in those countries have been risen out of poverty. And if you really cared about equality, you'd probably give that some credit. We'd say socialism, moreover, and government failure creates a lot of inequality as well, like minimum wages and terrible systems of public education. Lastly, on the environment, many people will concede, sure, capitalism makes us richer, but it's a devastating cost of the environment. That's not true. I'll give you 3 reasons why it's better than socialism. Firstly, because the immense wealth that capitalism provides gives us the means to do things like spending on conservation, gives us the means to do things like drive Euro 5 compliant cars and do other things that care for the environment. How much do you think the average Soviet citizen really cared about the state of the forests and rivers when you spend 3 hours a day queuing for a loaf of bread and then go home to tear strips off the curtains to use as toilet paper? We'd also say, secondly, capitalism is more efficient than socialism. It uses fewer resources for the same amount of output. It took 4 times as many raw materials to make a car in the Soviet Union as it did to make an equivalent car in Japan. 4 times as many greenhouse gases, 4 times as much mining, 4 times as much deforestation. Socialist central planning wreaks havoc on the environment. Thirdly, private property gives you an incentive to actually look after the capital value of natural resources like land. Secondly, and lastly, capitalism forces us by the market mechanism to put our prejudices behind us because the only colour it cares about is green, and that means you're likely to be less racist and not care about irrelevant factors when employing and buying from people we're so proud to propose.
Speaker is about to come on, but I'll just remind people that for the last section of this, we're going to open up to the floor. So if you've got questions, comments, all of that, just file them away. Get ready to chuck your hand up. But I welcome Karavias, who's the Education Officer with the National Union of Students and a member of Socialist Alternative.
All right, well, aside from the weird fetish for toilet paper, that was actually a good bit of fun, I thought, to start just with a few brief rebuttals. Because first of all, there's a point about poverty, and I think the starting point for this is actually, by any serious metric, poverty has massively increased over the past few years. The way this is glossed over is that the standard for poverty internationally is decided by the World Bank. So in 2015, the World Bank arbitrarily doubled what was deemed to be living in poverty, and miraculously, overnight, what do you know, over 100 million people were lifted out of poverty straight away by them shifting the number. That's not actually making people richer, that's bullshitting about the system that you preside over. Beyond that as well, I think poverty generally is not actually the best metric for how shitty and deplorable people's lives. So in India, for instance, 60% of the people who live above what is officially deemed as the poverty line still suffer serious risks of malnutrition, a lack of access to clean water, and all that sort of stuff. And even with the World Bank lifting the poverty line, right now that sits at $1.90 a day internationally. So that's the glorious life capitalism is leading us into, having a couple of bucks a day and all that sort of stuff. I want to get onto the thing, because John raised the question of exploitation. We need to prove that capitalists are inherently exploitative, that they don't deserve their profits, that profits instead are just generated miraculously by things like price lines and so forth, not lifted straight out of the pockets of workers. And I think, in a sense, John proves it through his own argumentation. Because the thing that people always say who support the system, support the role of capitalists in it, is that without the rich and powerful, nothing would ever happen. If you didn't have Gina Reinhardt in society, no mines would ever be dug, no fossil fuels would ever be excavated, no power would exist. If you didn't have Rupert Murdoch, you'd never read anything again for the rest of your life. No one would write anything, no one would produce anything, no one would throw newspapers in people's front yards on a Sunday morning and all that sort of stuff. So it's this weird, almost fetishistic, superstitious veneration of the people at the top of our society, when the reality is These people are a redundancy in our society, and you do see that every single time the people they employ actually threaten to stand up for themselves or do anything to benefit their own lives. So people might have seen a few weeks ago, the train drivers in Sydney threatened to go on strike. Now, the response of the press in Sydney, the Murdoch media, the state government, and all that sort of stuff was not to say, who cares if these workers go on strike? We don't need workers, we just need the people who own the railway lines, own the stations and so forth. No, it was mass hysteria because they know if those workers don't turn up to work on that day, nothing happens, no trains move, the entire system grinds to a halt. And so the reality of the world that we live in is everything that happens, everything that exists, this building, the chairs within it, the curtains at the back, the clothes you're wearing, the content that is taught in your subjects at university, it is all done through the labour of working class people. If the Vice Chancellor of this university did not come in tomorrow, it would not stop classes from happening, the buildings would not implode, the power would not go out, nothing would change. And that's the reality of capitalism as a system. A tiny minority festers off the work that we do, but provides nothing for it themselves. And that includes the production of capital or whatever other things you wanted to raise. Tied in with that, I wanted to address the question, Matthew used the word flourishing 1,000,001 times in his sort of introduction. Capitalism is a system in which people flourish. No, capitalism is a system in which the vast majority of humanity are massively oppressed, constrained, confined, and never able to let their natural capacities express themselves, to explore their own creativity, their own brilliance, what they can offer the world, and so forth. Because the system, because the organisation of society is dictated entirely by what will maximise profits for people at the top, it means, first of all, that you have hundreds of millions of people around the world who spend their entire lives doing facile, monotonous, skillless, boring, tedious, soul-crushing, body-destroying labour. Your alarm goes off at 5 in the morning, you want to shoot yourself, but instead you force yourself into this horrendous workplace where you have no control of what you can do, want to be, etc. That's the first way in which capitalism massively wastes people's lives. This also ties into why the capitalist system and the economy is totally tied up with the institutions of power in our society, the state, the government, and so forth, that are meant to just be authoritarian, socialist, and what you will. Actually, if you look at the economy under capitalism, it's infinitely more authoritarian than any government ever has been in the history of the world, and I include every dictatorship which calls itself socialist in that category. You only have to think, you go to work today, your boss tells you what to wear, how to act, if you work in retail, what sort of facial expressions you have, the intonations in your voice. Are you modulating eloquently enough as you speak to someone in a way that will be friendly to them? If a government said tomorrow at 5 p.m, everyone has to dress up in this way, go to this place and do this task for 4 hours, we would think we had woken up in a totalitarian nightmare. But that is the reality of what capitalism is in our society, an oppressive, hierarchical system in which the wants and needs of the vast majority of people mean absolutely nothing. I want to briefly address then the further kind of social and environmental questions, because you're right to say that the only colour that matters is green under capitalism, but for the people who care about wealth to be able to continue to preside over such a hierarchical authoritarian system, it means they rely on a number of other ideological tools, mechanisms, weapons and so forth to divide, separate, weaken, atomise and keep down the people that they exploit. And so, like you raised the United States, it's an entire country that is built on the exploitation of black slaves, built on treating minorities, now immigrant workers, as a systematic underclass whom the bourgeoisie can hyper-exploit. Of course these people want to prosecute racist ideas. If you're currently employing Latino workers in some factory in a northern city in America at this point in time, you have a vested interest in propagating a racist ideology that says that those people deserve to be treated as lesser than other people. Same with when African Americans were enslaved. There was a vested interest in the people presiding over that society and demonizing, racially vilifying and so forth those workers. It's a way to keep them down and keep the mass of people that they exploit divided. You can see the same sort of logic play into the destruction of the environments, living spaces and so forth. From the point of view of the capitalist class, they have to compete ruthlessly with one another at every single point in time. That means on a second by second, minute by minute basis, they have to maximise their profits. And so if you preside over a coal industry, where you can make billions of dollars in the here and now by building enormous coal mines and destroying and polluting the environment. That's what you're going to do, and you're going to use the media and so forth to justify those processes. So sure, they care about money first and foremost, but when your system is based around prioritizing wealth over human beings, it necessitates a whole series of other ideologies that demonize, divide, and weaken the rest of society. I want to end by briefly talking about the alternative, because socialism is not a system in which the government does stuff or there's a nefarious Big Brother organisation presiding over all of us. Socialism is a radically democratic view of the way that the world should operate. It is the simple idea that the people who already produce all the wealth in society should actually have control over what they do while they produce those wealth. That builders should not just build whatever a developer demands of them to build. That university staff should not just teach whatever Simon Birmingham and Malcolm Turnbull deem is appropriate to exist on a school or university curriculum. But the people who already make the world run should themselves run the world. And I think if we had a society like that, then the issues that we have today could evaporate, because as Elliot said before, there's no basis for starvation anymore. There's no basis for homelessness. There's no basis for the 1,000,001 miseries, inequalities and barbarities that ordinary people's lives are afflicted with. The only basis is the parasitical class that benefits from those things. Well, if the mass of us took over, we could get rid of not just them, but all the issues that they create overnight. And that's the what we have to fight for.